Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
In this course on the liturgy, Jordan Daniel Wood delineates the Christologic that is brought about in the incarnation. It's no longer merely apophaticism or cataphaticism. There is the joining of the symbolic and what it symbolizes, that Christ is God. And so it's not merely a matter of opposing Plato and Aristotle, but there is a whole new order of logic. If you're enjoying these podcasts with Jordan Daniel Wood, we hope you'll like us on social media, that you'll follow Forging Plowshares. Our podcast, you'll point others to Forging Plowshares, and that you'll subscribe then to Walking Truth. If you're thinking of taking a class or getting a seminary education, Plowshares Bible Institute offers the equivalent of a 3-year education at an affordable price. In the upcoming year, we're offering courses on Bernard Lonergan, on the Inklings, on George MacDonald's, among other things. You might even think of supporting us, that we are a donation-based ministry dependent upon the goodwill of those who may benefit from the work that we're doing. But hope you enjoy this podcast then on the liturgy and on Christologic with Jordan Daniel Wood.
How's it going up there, Jeff? Y'all thawing out?
Oh, it's spring. Spring here in Canada. So now we get to finally enjoy what you guys have probably been enjoying for several months now. Shorts. Well, it's not quite short weather here, but
I know my neighbors are going to start complaining. I have very short window to go out and mow my lawn, and by the time I get to it every week, it's grown up to jungle-like proportions. So
grass doesn't grow here yet. So it's still asleep because it snowed last week. So
oh, that must be wonderful. Yeah. I keep hoping my lawn will all die, but it never. Well, I always think this is as close as I'll ever come to being a farmer. So,
grass farmer.
Yeah, that's it. Nathan, we missed you last week.
I needed to go and take care of Mom, so that's why I wasn't here.
How old is your mother?
72.
Yeah, the 70s suddenly sound much younger than they used to.
Yeah. It doesn't sound as old to me as it used to either now that I'm over 50. So,
yeah.
Well, it's funny too. When I was younger, it's interesting because people look so much younger now, like than they did. Like, because when I was a kid, it's like people who were in their 50s like look like people who are in their 70s now.
Like the Rolling Stones are still on tour.
Yeah, right, exactly.
They're all in their 80s. My goodness.
Yeah.
The drugs and smoking and I guess that's the way to go.
Yeah. It's all about perspective. You know, my wife read a meme to me off of Facebook the other day that said, you know, when I was 5 years old, I thought quicksand was going to be a much bigger problem in the world than it actually is.
Yeah. That's what is that? That's Mulvaney, I think.
Yeah. I can claim to have actually, I think, got caught in quicksand. I used to ride my horse, you know, I rode all over the Panhandle, and I was riding on the Canadian River, and rode it out. I'd always go out, I'd kind of stomp on the sand to make sure and I rode him out on that sand, and immediately he started sinking. And
was it dry or wet? Wet sand.
It was wet. And he got up to his hocks, and I got off. I just stood there and watched him. I don't know what to do. He laid there for quite a long time, and I thought, well, I enjoyed the cool period on the bank of the river, and he eventually lunged out. He managed to get himself out of it. Do you all know about adobe walls? If you're not from Texas, adobe walls was the place where the big two Indian wars occurred. There really wasn't much there. It was just a place where the buffalo hunters went. They had little, stone buildings. Billy Dixon, he made a shot, this fantastic shot, and hit one of the Indians, and that kind of ended the war. But that's what I was doing. I was going to Adobe Walls, which has since become an archaeological dig. When I was out there was nothing out there. There may have been a sign, but that was it. Good morning to you, Jordan.
Good morning, everybody. How's it going?
Very good.
Every single time I sit down to get ready, I put up this little screen behind me and I hit my knee on the table and my coffee spills, which is why I have this now right next to my like it's just unbelievable how every single time.
You've done it enough times, you're prepared, and you just leave the towel sitting there. So every time you hit your knee and spill your coffee, you can just clean it right up.
Exactly right. Yeah. As I'm, saying words, I hope my kids
Sounds
don't
like
hear.
you've got a pretty good ritual going.
That's right. I am discerning the synaxes and all of this and seeing God objectified. So yeah, guys. So anyway, thanks for coming. We are kind of amazingly at the 6th week out of 8. This was one of the more unified. I mean, we had one thing to read, but it was pretty long. It gets pretty dense. I don't think probably it's a mystery to you anymore how someone could spend like most of their life reading this guy. And then, of course, people that do that, they still don't even all agree. Nope, not everybody agrees with me how I read them, so forth and so forth. So, but that's the richness of it. I think that's what kind of brings me at least coming back over and over again, rereading this text. I was like, well, never noticed that before. Never noticed that before, So I did want to spotlight a little bit the supplemental materials that I gave. Ambiguum 41 is, I really think it probably is the most famous text of Maximus, mainly because of the use that in the West that Eriugena makes of it. In the 9th century, Eriugena is this Irish Latin speaking and writing, savant or whatever, who was one of the few people at that time and place who could not only read Greek but was translating it. So he's reading like Saint Gregory of Nyssa, he's reading Dionysius and Maximus and translating various parts of their works. But he runs with, like, he begins his whole massive, in English, like 750-page something book called On the Divisions of Nature with his own divisions, which I think are very interesting in themselves. But it's funny because it's across 5 books. In the second book, it's like he's read and contemplated more on Maximus's 5 divisions from Ambiguum 41, and now he sort of takes that up. And anyway, so there's a whole legacy there around that text. It's related to the mystagogy for this week because not all of the divisions, but a few of them are recapitulated here, like the division between intelligible and sensible, or the division between heaven and earth, within the sensible realm. So those are all there in 41. 41's a really nice, one of those panoramic type texts. It's where you also get, though, this sense that the vocation of the human being in the world is to act in a priestly way, to mediate things that are distinguished naturally, to bring them together in creative activity, through spiritual activity. So that text just wanted to flag. I threw in another text from one of my friends, Justin Coyle. It's going to be published. I think it's in the other journal, but that issue isn't out yet. So he graciously gave me permission to give you guys, just a draft copy of that essay. It's his own kind of personal contemplation on. He's a deacon in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, so he participates in liturgy all the time, and it's kind of a reflection of his, somewhat inspired by Maximus. You'll see on the divine liturgy as he experiences, especially with respect to time, which I especially loved. The way that the liturgy. Like, there's a kind of way in general where, and we'll get into this a little bit with our text today, but where people can, I think one way to sell the higher liturgy for those of us like myself that don't come from a background of a high church background or high liturgy is to kind of I don't know how to put it, re-embed it in the rhythms of nature, or something where it's like, this is sort of tapping into like not primitive, but ancient human beings already had this sense that we're embedded in this kind of grand ornamented world and arrangement, and that's true. Like there's no denying that. But what's so interesting about Justin's essay that I shared with you guys is he also notes, though, that it can work the exact opposite. That sometimes the liturgy is opposing the rhythms of nature. In particular, there he's thinking about the ravages of time. Time is just a bare linear, one thing after another. Things are generated, things are corrupted. And it's funny because even within the liturgical, like commentary tradition on the liturgy that he knows, some did want to initially, there was like a big division over which direction to proceed around the altar at a certain point in the liturgy. And one of the arguments was, well, we should go this direction because that's like the direction the sun, for them at the time, sun rotates around the earth. And actually they ended up choosing, like, someone else ended up winning out, but it was the exact opposite direction. And so Justin, that caused him to sort of reflect, or I guess Maximus would say, like, contemplatively on that as a kind of itself revelatory thing, that actually the procession goes against time. The time of the liturgy is like a counter time, but that's a way of transfiguring time, all this stuff. So anyway, you can check that out. And then I sent you as well. It's like a link, an embedded link to and Adam Cooper, he's another Maximus scholar of his own sort of stature. I really liked his book on the body in St. Maximus. There's things I would add or whatever. That's always the case. He's got a nice little reflection, although some of what I'm going to say today will diverge a little from his. So, all right. So let's move into it today, because my goal, which I sort of betrayed last week, is to try to restrict myself a little more, and because I want to invite more conversation around action. And what we're talking about here in the last half of this course are actions or practices, the stuff that makes up the spiritual life, the Christian life. And the corporate and individual, hopefully you're seeing that. Like last week, we talked about reading scripture. I think probably naturally a lot of the register there was personal reading. But of course, you saw in the text today, he's got meditation on scripture in the liturgy, right? And here's the emphasis here is definitely on the way the liturgy's activity brings together, right? That one phrase in from chapter 2, effects oneness and diversity, the very oneness and diversity of God. Like this is what the church, even the building, right, is kind of doing or imaging. As always with Maximus, these actions that we're contemplating are not discrete. You can think of them in terms of certain aspects or dimensions, but ultimately they're one. Right? They're all headed towards a sort of unity and oneness. And when we consider them, we're sort of artificially considering them insofar as we're considering them individually or one at a time. Nevertheless, I still want to try to restrict myself a little bit more and not speak for ad nauseum, because I do want to hear more your guys' thoughts. And it doesn't have to be some brilliant observation on a text or something. It could also just be how this is resonating or not with your own experiences. So I hope to be able to meet that goal today rather than betray it. So let's see what happens. Let's get underway here. All right, so we're on week 6, action number 2, the liturgy. And hopefully you notice I do place the stress on action. Right, because right from the beginning, I mean, not the very beginning, but the first chapter, after the prologue, which we'll get to in a second, he says, and of course Maximus, right, is attributing all this to this blessed elder, nameless blessed elder. He does that a lot, actually. This isn't the only text he does that. So there probably really was legitimately a person that he has in mind, or a group. Sometimes people have said Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem, somebody he corresponds to with and knows. But it could be somebody else altogether. But anyway, he says, so he's presenting this at the behest of his addressee, this person that maybe it was somebody that was mentioned in the trial we read at the beginning, but we're not going to get into that. He's presenting in written form the contemplations or the interpretation almost of the liturgy that he heard from this blessed elder. Okay, so this is chapter 1. It begins, therefore, as the first point of his, that is the blessed elder's contemplation. Oh, well, he says, the blessed elder said that the Holy Church bears the representation. And I want to kind of stop there. Anytime you see the word representation in your translation, it's type. It's typos. Familiar to you probably from the book of Hebrews, type and representation or a shadow of things to come. But type or representation, an image of God, because she, that is the church, possesses the same activity. The word there, activity, energia, it's all the way back to Aristotle. There's potency, something has potential, and then it has actuality. It actualizes that potential. That's the word, energia. Actualize, activity. So the church possesses the same activity or action as his, that is God's, according to imitation and type. So, all right. So that's the kind of the emphasis really is going to be, the accent's going to fall on, I almost want to call it event, right? The happening, the occurrence, the action, activity, the cooperative, creative bringing about. This is really at the heart of liturgy. And so some of what we're going to discuss today, I'm going to discuss like a topography a little bit from the text, but also this sort of like achievement. What is actually being achieved, what is actually being done. Some of the questions I sent you for this week were along those lines as well. So, okay, so to begin with, though, just a few general remarks. I'm going to then make a few specific remarks about, almost like I would call it here, the phenomenology or topography of his discussion of the church and how it's also the universe and it's also the human, right? All that. So like almost spatially divided. I'm going to kind of talk about that, and then we're going to kind of end with this activity, this event character of all this. So that's the kind of outline for the day. General remarks. Here we go. I did want to kind of begin broadly because, as I've already alluded to, I was not personally brought up anything like a high church context. In fact, it's explicitly the opposite. I mean, like avowedly and intentionally not that. Paul knows what I'm talking about. He's very, very well familiar with that tradition. I was in the Stone Campbell tradition. By the way, my whole family still is, so it's not like I've got bad blood or anything. And they've actually graciously been very supportive of me being Catholic now for over 10 years, or about 10 years, and they just are always interested. So I've had a lot of support. So I have there's no like resentment here. But nevertheless, it really was the church I grew up in, the part-time, I guess, pastor was really just a farmer down the road, like outside of the small town called Wentzville, Missouri. That's where I was from. Now it's not so small, but it was really small.
Once you're in the Christian church, you really can't leave.
Yeah, there's an indelible mark.
Yeah, I mean, whatever else you do, you're branded. So,
well, it is true. You might have noticed that I'm kind of obsessed with talking about Jesus, and I have to say the caricatures of my now fellow Catholics are not entirely wrong. I remember, Paul. I do have to tell this story now that you said that, just because I was teaching at Providence College, which is a Dominican school, and I'm in this program where you're team teaching. It's like a great books program, but I'm team teaching with people from other disciplines: philosophy, history, classics, literature, English literature. Okay, not going to get into the structure, but it was funny because one time part of the structure is that you do run seminars as well as there's some big gatherings and lectures and stuff. But so anyway, we're doing these seminars and they're concurrent. So like my colleague is in the next room has 15 students. I have 15 students over here and we're doing our thing. We're discussing like a 2-hour discussion over Homer or whatever. So, well, here we were talking about the Gospel of Mark because that's a part of this first semester, the sequence. The New Testament's like a part of it. And my colleague, he's like this 85-year-old retired philosophy professor. He grew up United Methodist, but so he always got a kick out of like just Catholics in general. He's from like he's from Iowa. He lives in Rhode Island, and he goes, he thought it was so interesting that I knew the Bible, like more than just like generically, somewhere in the Bible, or even like some. But like for me, and Paul knows this, like the drill was like you got to know the chapter and the verse. I mean, it's not enough to be somewhere in the book of Acts. It's like, no, I took a whole year on the book of Acts. So like I had to memorize massive swaths of this. And so, but it's funny because he walks in, this is totally unplanned. Or no, I walk in, I was going to tell him something. And he goes, wait, Dr. Wood, I'm going to show the students something. We're talking about Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 10. We were just talking about verse 45. What is Mark chapter 10, verse 45? Well, that was like the actual slogan verse of my Bible college. So I quoted, even the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to be served to give his life for his, and everyone's jaw dropped. And of course, I'm not telling them like that was really low hanging fruit there. I'm just like, oh yeah, I memorized the whole Bible anyway. So that doesn't leave you. You're right. You're never, you don't once you're there. And I do have this feeling. I mean, you're even going to probably, it comes out even when I'm talking like in these contexts, like I do feel that like the natural innate urge to always connect, eventually get around to connecting whatever we're talking about or saying to the Bible, some like specifically, really, not just generically. So I like that though. So I am grateful for that. But nevertheless, one of the things I didn't get was anything like liturgy, divine liturgy, not even Novus Ordo Mass, certainly not any Latin Mass, none of that. So I was not brought up in a lot of our Orthodox are not here today. So this class is the one participants because they're right in Holy Saturday right now for them, and so it's huge. They're in the middle of what the West calls Triduum, but they're in a different calendar, so that's why we don't have a lot of them today. But that wasn't at all a thing for me. I mean, for me, it was like the preacher. The preacher was a part-time preacher. He was also a full-time farmer. He also led the songs. His wife played the piano, and that was it. There was nothing else in there in the church. And the sermon was like 35 minutes, and you sang a few hymns. We did do communion every week. Pass it. It's like, but that was it. There was no like sense that this is like what this really was like a meeting. You would just hear some instruction about scripture. And what's so now, and those of you who are Anglican, or if you do go to some high church, Episcopalian, Catholic, whatever it is, and you could probably sense in this text here even that the very basic two components of most high liturgies are the liturgy of the word. So everything like through the readings, you're doing the 3 or 4 readings, you lead up to the gospel. And then there's the homily, it's kind of the break, like the word. The word is both read aloud as scripture, called the word of the Lord, and then someone speaks words about the word, right? That was written but also spoken. So this is like all about the word spoken, communicated, heard. Faith comes through hearing. Then there's a turn towards the liturgy of the altar, the table, the body of Christ, the Eucharist. And that's the culmination. You hopefully sense that that's also something like that. I mean, this is like probably something like Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is what Maximus was feeling, with some version of that. But that's the basic structure. And the important thing that should sort of color all of what we're going to say today is that the culmination is also the Eucharist. And what's so interesting in the mystagogy, as I mentioned in the text or the questions I threw you guys, is that he doesn't actually say much about it. I mean, he indicates it. It's not like he skips it or anything. And it comes at crucial moments, and we're actually going to look at one of those moments today. That's sort of the rhythm here. And so for me, I've had to kind of acquire this, and both as I studied Eastern Christianity broadly and the patristics generally, and Maximus in particular, I've really gotten this sense, and here's kind of the first general point, that, and this is a generalization, of course, but that the Eastern Christian traditions and writers and thinkers and even theology itself is so much more concerned with seeing. Like seeing, in both Balthazar's terms, I guess, seeing the form. right? And there's some reason. I just kind of sat down this morning. I was like, what? Maybe there's some reasons for this. One is I do think that the philosophical background that is predominant in most of the history of Eastern, Greek Orthodox Byzantine tradition is broadly Platonist. I can put it that way. And you could go to I mean, the word itself for form, right, or species, eidos. Built into that word is eidin, the verb to see. If you see the form of something, it becomes intelligible to you as a coherent unity that you could describe and debate. And Socrates will go around in Plato's dialogues and ask for what is I think they usually translate it, the definition or something of justice? What's the definition of piety? What's the definition but the word is form. Like when you call something just, what are you seeing? That it evokes that name. So there's this sense of like seeing, right? That when the mind contemplates something, even that word, right? You contemplate, you're sort of seeing with the whole reality itself, and it's one event. So, or Plato in the Timaeus will call the whole world a kind of icon, or time as a sort of image, equal an icon of eternity. So there's a lot of that imitation. We saw the word imitation just in the first lines here. Imitation or representation or type, right? All this stuff is like visual. Of course, you go to the New Testament and it's there as well. One of our favorites we've quoted, I think, in this course many times, Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, icon, right? Icon. And then, of course, you could kick it down the street later to even after Maximus's time, you get you get two major controversies called the iconoclast controversies. Isn't it just idolatry against, say, the Ten Commandments to image God, to put God in a physical representation, to paint God in a picture, right? And maybe even any saints for that matter. I mean, how could you, and certainly how could you venerate? And any of you go to or attend or you've been to an Eastern church, I've been into this one deacon's house and I couldn't believe, I mean, he probably had 500 icons in his house, and the house was like a duplex. It was like it was wall to wall. I couldn't believe, like, that's a little overkill even for me. And I like this stuff. But even in Catholic churches today is a little bit more prevalent than it once was. I think post Vatican II, there's that sense of recovering the Eastern sense of seeing and seeing God through icons. And isn't it the case that we're all becoming made according to the icon of God, and therefore we ourselves become icons, right? And so there's whole debates. And actually, two of the main people that defend icons and end up winning out in the later ecumenical councils for the East, especially, and by the way, they celebrate. They have a feast day in their calendar called the Triumph of Orthodoxy, but it's not about Nicaea. It's not about Chalcedon. It's not even about Constantinople too. It's about Constantinople or Nicaea too, the defense of icons, right? Which is now becomes dogma of the church there. So they defend that, and they call it the triumph of orthodoxy. But two of the major figures or representative figures of that whole debate on the side that won out, but both of them draw on Maximus, and specifically Maximus's Christology, to defend the representation of Christ and the saints. Because after all, as Maximus says in Ambiguum 10, one of the things that we should say about the incarnation is that in the incarnation, God became the symbol of himself. He became the image of himself. It's not as if his image is somehow other than him, because otherwise you're an historian, right? There's some other guy who was really close to the word of God, and so in a vague way kind of imaged him or imitated or reflected him, right? No, this guy that died on the cross was actually the image of God. So he's an image of himself. He mediates himself to you. And so why would it be idolatrous to resist the very thing that God himself effected in the incarnation? And so this way, seeing now is not just a Platonic thing, not even just kind of a word used in the New Testament thing, but it becomes an ongoing manifestation and even in a sense expanding scope of the incarnation itself. And if you got anything from the mystagogy and all of its kind of meanderings, hopefully you got that. That for Maximus, church, universe itself, the human being and the structure of the human being, even scripture itself, the world, he keeps calling all these things cosmi, right? Cosmi, worlds, cosmoses, you know? He keeps calling them all worlds, and they all are able to reflect and interpenetrate one another. Why? Because the one word of God is all of them at once in himself. He himself is the unity of all these disparate worlds. He is the one true world, you might even say. Okay, so that now we're really saying why we have to see, and the emphasis on seeing. Okay. So enough with the Eastern emphasis on seeing. I also just wanted to briefly mention we got some of Maximus's own emphases, I think, comes through here. I do think it's kind of interesting, and I don't want to be too cynical about it, but it's like this is a 24 chapter work. So it's roughly 3 parts or so, right? 1 through 8 is kind of this contemplation on the church, these different things that it represents in images. And then he turns in the last several chapters, especially before 23 and 24, to like individual elements, like first the entrance, then the people come in the nave, right? All this stuff. And then he gets some more really provocative and summative comments in 23 24 at the end, kind of recapitulating it all. Okay. But what's so funny to me is you get a lot of quick, shorter chapters on a lot of those other parts, except when you hit like 5. And why is that? Because when you hit 5, you get the human being and the soul and the body. Then you go on to like 6, and it's just the soul and the parts of the soul. How long is that chapter? That's really long, you know. He goes on and on about wisdom and prudence and the difference between logos or reason and the mind and how all these work together and how there's sort of pairs and syzygies and right. Like that's to me, I have to see a little bit there the kind of the concern or the preoccupation of a monk. That is his thing. I mean, you read the second volume of Philokalia. It's all this kind of stuff, right? It's the spiritual life. It's a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about next week when we get to prayer and judgment. Discrimination is another way to put it, but that word is fraught today for other reasons. So I'll just say judgment. Prayer and judgment next week, this sort of introspection, the stuff that you might normally associate with mystics and contemplatives and so forth. So it's just funny that even in this text, you can see that his emphasis coming through. However, there's a different emphasis that comes through that I don't think can just be chalked up to like, oh, he's a monk, he's interested in that. And that's this, I hope you noticed it throughout, but this kind of interesting relationship to a prior major authority of his that we've talked about already, Dionysius the Areopagite. Not too hard to see why this work would especially call for that, right? Because one of the only figures that had composed something even like this was Dionysius's ecclesiastical hierarchy, where he's not just giving you sort of description of the church, he's giving you meanings and here's what it's doing and the emphasis on activity. He has to kind of deal with that up front, right? Why am I writing another work whenever one of my authorities already treated this? And he says, well, I'm not doing what he did. I'm doing something different here. And I've been asked to do this. And, so there's all this way of posturing it. But nevertheless, in fact, Maximus is generically his relationship to Dionysius is actually what initially drew me to Maximus. That's what I was going to focus on was like, because it isn't straightforward. I mean, there's a lot of good arguments and clear arguments, of course, indisputable ones that Dionysius is a major authority, right, for him. He's got major influence. But you remember, like, last week, some of the stuff, like one of the things I mentioned that I learned from Father Maximus, one of my teachers, was the word hierarchy, like, doesn't even show up in Maximus. But that's all that Dionysius is about, But there's a few other things. I wanted to read this. This was quoted in Cooper's essay that I shared, but it's a famous text from Dionysius. This is where he defines hierarchy. It's a word he coined. Dionysius did. What did not exist in Greek prior to him. He coins it. Here's how he defines it. I think this actually does come from the ecclesiastical hierarchy, but I forgot to check that. It says hierarchy is, to my mind, a sacred order, knowledge, and activity, which involves being assimilated to likeness with God as much as possible, and in response to the illuminations that are given it from God, it is raised to the imitation of him in his own measure. This is an interesting text for a few reasons in relation to ours for this week. One is that this is a famous text from Dionysius. It's quoted and shows up throughout the centuries. So, it's not like Maximus wouldn't know this. And of course, there are a lot of things here that resonate with Maximus, right? That you've even read. I mean, this emphasis knowledge, obviously. Order, we don't get as much actually, but knowledge, definitely. Activity is right there in the first chapter we already saw in Ergia. Likeness, of course, assimilation, definitely. However, there's a little caveat I want to make here. I mean, imitation, right? Illumination shows up here and there. But there's two things to consider, or well, three things here, right? These are three just kind of examples or points where Maximus's relation to Dionysius is it's interestingly complicated, put it that way. I've already mentioned the thing about hierarchy, doesn't really use it. There's theosis, of course, which this text and another text similarly define theosis as likeness with God. I mean, it seems obvious. Likeness to God doesn't seem controversial. But if you were to go to Ambiguum 21.15, Maximus at one point says, and he knows this is going to be controversial because he says that the goal of theosis, quote, if this is not too onerous for someone to bear, is to not remain a mere simulacrum. Simulacrum, is one way that it's translated, but it's the same word that's used here, likeness. Not to remain a mere likeness, but to even become the Lord himself. Maximus says that in Ambiguum 21.15. So it's like sometimes he's cool with just the likeness sort of language that Dionysius uses, so I'm not denying that. But then other moments like Ambiguum 21.15, and I think a few other moments in our text today, his emphasis on identity seems to go beyond Dionysius's. The last point, and this will open up our discussion of the text today, is Maximus's very interesting relationship to what Dionysius is probably most famous for, certainly in the West, is what's called apophatic theology or negative theology. It sounds really fancy. Many of you are probably already familiar with it. But in some, it's just that when Dionysius in his famous work, The Divine Names, goes to contemplate our language and how it relates to God and like whether or not it's adequate. I mean, isn't it the case that all of our names and words and language derive from our experience and labeling and naming of finite things, of creatures? And if that's the case, then how could those exact same words and language, how could that be adequate to God? So Dionysius has this it's a nice, beautiful, I think, intuitive dialectic where he says, well, look, two things are true about creatures. And this creates two sort of poles in our language in reference to God. On the one hand, they are sourced in God. I mean, they come from God. God is the cause. And precisely because he's cause, it's like they express something that's also in God in some way. Right? They don't have anything they haven't received from God. Therefore, it's sort of already in God, whatever they have. And so, in that sense, you can affirm, it's called cataphatic, you can affirm things of God with and from words and images of creatures, and especially the names, the divine names given in Scripture. I mean, he does prioritize Scripture. And it's okay, for example, to call God a father, even though that doesn't mean God got married one day and settled down and had kids, There's something about fatherhood that nevertheless does fit God in relation to it. Okay, so we can affirm things like that. But then he also comes along and says, we also need to remove or negate apophasis, apophatic, negation. We also need to negate the very same things that we affirm of God. And interestingly, paradoxically, for the same reason. Because God is cause, yes, he gives to creatures what he already has, but also he always is more than whatever he gives. And so he's not just father because he creates fathers, and we know fatherhood in our from our own experience first, and then call God Father in the prayer. But also he negates that because he isn't just that, and he's more than that actually, and maybe you can even call him mother and so forth. So So this is kind of the rhythm, right? It's the dialectic. You kind of go back and forth, and what we affirm of God helps us say things about God intelligently, but then you have to kind of purify that language by negating, right? So forth. Okay. So I think that's kind of intuitive. I don't think it's without problems, to be honest with you, but it's nevertheless it's like kind of something people East and West have taken up more or less in different degrees, different times. What's interesting though with Maximus is so Dionysius is explicitly willing to say that negation's better, though. It's a higher form of talking about God than affirmation. But he also has this third moment where he says, but we even need to negate the negations because ultimately we need to kind of rest in silence. No word is adequate, not even a negative one, right? Dionysius is willing to even say things like in the mystical theology, like even Trinity is like language we can negate. So that's kind of, it's made people uneasy. People like scholars like Paul Roram, the good Lutheran, wasn't too happy with that. Oh, he's a great scholar of Dionysius. Why do I bring all this up? Because notice what Maximus says in the prologue when he's flagging his relationship to Dionysius. And I do think it's related. I asked you a question this week about this, and I'm going to kind of get at it and through that question. I'm not going to go through the whole prologue, but let's just go towards the end. So he says, God is by nature in the same class as absolutely nothing of the things that are, and for this reason he allows us to say rather than that he is not. That's the affirmation, and this is the emphasis on negation, right? That he is not, because it is more properly said of him that he transcends being. There I kind of feel like, all right, he's going with Dionysius there. He's more proper to say he's beyond being. For it is necessary, if we're to know truly the difference between God and creatures, we must know that the negation of the things that are is the affirmation of the one who transcends being. And then the affirmation of the things that are is the negation of the one who transcends being. He says this elsewhere as well, but this is one of those texts. So actually now what we're getting into is not just that you need to affirm something of God like he's Father, then negate it, but he's not really Father. Actually, what he's saying is you're always doing both at the same time. When you affirm he is Father, and if what you mean is in reference to the way you know Father, then it's kind of like a negation of the one above. But then when you negate that he's not Father in the way you might normally think of it, you actually are making an affirmation about the one above. You see how he thinks they're interlinked, they're interwoven. So that's already getting interesting, a little different flavor. Not totally different, but let's keep going though. Okay. And both designations can be reverently contemplated about him. Yet neither, here's where we start to turn. Yet neither is possible in a proper sense. I'm speaking of the existence, or might just say the being or non-being of God. Both are possible in a proper sense. So he just said they're not possible. Neither is possible in a proper sense. Now he's saying, but also they're both are proper. They all both can be. And he says this, on the one hand, it can be affirmed that God is because he is the cause of things that are. Okay, that affirmation thing we already talked about. But on the other hand, it can be completely negated that God is because of his superiority as cause of the things that are. Notice this. It's totally proper to say God is and God is not, and for the same exact reason, because he's cause. Later, even in the Neoplatonic tradition that isn't specifically Christian, there's a guy named Damascius. He's like one of the last in the sort of Neoplatonic tradition, post-Proclus, post-Plotinus, all that. But he sees this too already, and he the point is to call God cause is already to affirm something that you also need to negate. Damascius will say God actually isn't even the cause. And it's just as proper to say God is not the cause of anything as it is to say God is the cause of all things. You see, the problem is cause is already sneaking in a certain logic, and the logic is the one of sequence. Once again, always that. First cause is there, then effects come later. And look, Maximus also can use that language. He sometimes will take from Dionysius and other people, he'll refer to creation as the things, quote, after God. Things after God, okay? But you see how this isn't just a bunch of weird metaphysical points, that this starts to really bear on in what sense can you even know God? right? You see, this is where it's going, and then it starts to bring up things. Well, in what sense can God even appear, like be imaged? So now we're into liturgy and image and symbols, and the words of Scripture are also symbols. In what sense can you speak intelligently, God? So now we're into theology or reasoning. What are we even saying? What are we doing when we talk about God? Like the whole task of theology, is it even possible? Right. So you see how quickly this sort of, there's a suction effect that like kind of takes us. We think we're kind of on the right track and all of a sudden we're not just off the rails, we're being lifted off the rails into who knows where. We don't know where we're going, you know. Okay, but let's keep tracking with him. So he seems to be pushing the Dionysian sort of dialectic, as it were, to its like extreme, and you kind of are starting to feel unsettled. At least I do. Okay, fine. So it's proper to both affirm and negate, right? That's the point, that God is or is not. But then look, and again, neither is possible in a proper sense. Because neither establishes the very essence and nature of what existence is concerning the one whom we seek. I think that's a hugely important move. What's so fascinating to me about this, and you can find it in other thinkers too, even some weird ones like Marius Victorinus from the 4th century, but there's a kind of internal opening in the whole logic of cause and effect, especially in the Neoplatonic tradition. Because if you're really, really serious about God as cause means you need to negate all your normal, typical, intuitive notions about what God is like, then you also have to be open in principle to God revealing God's self in a positive way you've never conceived or couldn't have conceived. In other words, a truly apophatic negative theology is the kind of preparing ground, the clearing ground, and the preparation soil for the possibility of an otherwise unthinkable affirmation of God. In other words, revelation. So, because he said, right, we don't know, neither are proper because we don't know the very essence and nature of what existence is concerning about the one whom we seek. That is the one above existence. We don't know what the existence above existence is even like. So how could you know how that existence could reveal itself in our existence? You would have to know something more than just something negative to know, for example, God couldn't become incarnate. But how do you know that? Does that mean you know something about what it means to be the one above all creatures? See where this is going? It's a really interesting, because at least in the West, we're really used to like very hard demarcations, for example, between faith and reason, philosophy and revelation or whatever. I don't think that's going to work ultimately, and it certainly doesn't here. All right, keep going a little bit more. We're almost to the heart of this. For nothing at all, whether it exists or does not exist, is united with him, that is God, by nature, because he is their cause. Neither anything of the things that are and are spoken, nor, and here's the key, nor anything of the things that are not and are not spoken in any way comes near to him. So now you start to see that speaking and silence are both equally on their own inadequate. Affirmation on its own, inadequate. Negation on its own, inadequate. Sure, you can say it's proper and improper in its own way, but then when you pull back even farther, you say, but also it's also just as improper as the other thing that's proper and improper. It's negation, right? Negation and affirmation are themselves a negation and an opposition. And is there something that unites them? You see how this gets really okay. I do think this relates. It might sound like, what in the world does this have to do with liturgy? But and when you first read that, I think you should think that, like, is he just riffing on Dionysius because Dionysius wrote something on liturgy? No, I don't think so. There's something more interesting going on. Okay, so he says that both of them fail, and he says, for he, as God, has an existence that is simple and unknowable and inaccessible to everyone, and that is completely indescribable and beyond every cataphatic and apophatic statement. So where do we just land? We landed somewhere beyond, in my opinion, at least the way Dionysius is normally received. You could argue about whether he has the resources in his own thought for this same kind of move, and maybe he does. But what you got is, this is the limit of what we can say and how much we can or can't access God when you're simply thinking about God as like an object that you can or can't approximate, like abstractly. When you're thinking about God abstractly, you're going to run into these puzzles that have no exit. God is cause, therefore everything reveals God. Yeah, but God is cause, therefore God is before everything, and so nothing really reveals God. Which is it? Well, it's both. Well, how is that? I don't know. Well, you got to say something. No, I don't. But then even your silence is failure. True. So it's this silence is speaking, whether you want to speak or not. It is an intentional decision not to affirm. But then that itself is already a kind of secret affirmation that God is, that God is the one that can't be affirmed. But that's an affirmation. So apophatic and cataphatic are absolutely wrapped up into each other. Silence and speaking are absolutely wrapped up into each other. Accessibility and inaccessibility absolutely wrapped up into each other. I might even say mediation and immediacy are absolutely wrapped up into each other. Abstractly, there's no way out. Whichever one you want to prioritize over the other, he's saying they're equally failures on their own. You see, the point is, what I think he's setting up a little bit, he's not just doing this, well, look, here's how I kind of think of Dionysius now that I mentioned him, since he wrote a work that's relevant to this one. It's not that. I think what he's doing is he's saying there's no way to get beyond this unless the actual unity and oneness transcends this whole kind of approach. In other words, it's got to be like an event, an activity, which even Dionysius says the hierarchy is really about an activity. And I think that's right. Like hierarchy isn't some static taxonomy. Even in Dionysius, it's to do something. So yes, he's going to go through all the orders of the church. And of course, he's got that other work, the celestial hierarchy, where he goes through the orders of the angels, and he sees this whole long cascading set of taxonomic stratifications. But even in Dionysius, if I wanted to quickly make a little apology for him, I'm not writing off Dionysius. Dionysius complicates it because he stresses that the hierarchy is activity, but activity is a horizontal thing, right? So you have all these you've got all this sort of this stratification of being, but what happens when they do something? Then you have like the fourth dimension, time, like they're going to go somewhere. They have to enact something. And when they do, what results? What's the product? It can't just be constantly reproducing their order across time like this. It makes lower orders more illumined, more purified, his orders, more purified, more illumined, more unitive, more one. So that's interesting dynamic within Dionysius himself that kind of complicates sometimes his own overly schematic thing. The other thing is Jesus. Again, back to my restoration roots, right? The other thing is Jesus is, and we've said this before, Jesus is also the bottom of the hierarchy, even in Dionysius. So what does that mean? The top and the bottom, the first and the last, right? So, okay. I think that's all really, really important because Maximus then can both claim that he does have one foot, right, in the soil of his authority, Dionysius, but through his own Christology, through post-Chalcedonian developments, through this sort of refinement of the incarnation and thinking of the incarnation and then applying it to everything, I do think he sees more clearly those strands in Dionysius, and he extends and develops them in his own way, which is why we're going to get a few statements that we're going to look at for the remainder of this time that are pretty astounding. Okay, that I don't necessarily know if it would be intuitive to somebody with just Dionysius, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
Before you head into talking about the liturgy, perhaps, I'm wondering if that is Maximus stepping out from the Dionysian model and the Platonic model, which it seemed like had this tension with, when you were talking a while ago about seeing the forms and the image base of early Christianity, was in a really direct tension with Plato at that point, right? Because Plato did not believe in representing. He was not big on art. That's kind of 101,
right?
Early philosophy.
Right.
But Maximus here is sort of stepping out of Plato, but he's not stepping into the Aristotelian model. But like you and Paul in y'all's earlier conversations pointed out, with Bulgakov in between, something else, not Plato, not Aristotle. So I was wondering if that was relevant and if it could help maybe some of us have more of a handle on this
Yeah.
here that Maximus is making.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I know some people quibble with me because it's sort of it's like in fashion right now to retrieve like the theurgic, Neoplatonism, John Milbank, and a lot of radical orthodoxy people. Now, look, I have an interesting kind of relationship with that whole with those guys because on the one hand, I get why they're doing that, and I kind of like I sympathize with it, right? The idea is, put it in the terms you were just saying, Brian. And actually, this is the way I was taught, although I didn't really think of it as Platonist at the time, but it's just more like common sense, where if something is an image for something else, then they're two different things. There's the image and the imaged. There's the symbol and the reality symbolized. There's the words and the meaning, or whatever. The signifier and the signified, the whatever in the referent, reference and referent. And that just seems obvious that those are two different things. And that's actually why they even have a relation at all, is because there's a relation between two distinct entities of whatever sort. What's so complicated in the incarnation is you can't easily do that without being Nestorius. The one who's crucified, is that a symbol of God's love? Or is it God who is love crucified? We immediately get into this kind of methodological abstract dual oppositions, right? Well, but I mean, divinity, humanity are not the same. Creator and creature are not the same. Cause and effect, not the same, right? So, yeah, but he really was born of Mary. He really is human. Okay, but then is he also? This is like the heart of Christology. This is the whole ball game right here. Another way to put it is think all the way back to I think it was like the second week we read Ambiguum 5, and it's a commentary sort of on Dionysius. What's so brilliant about that text, I don't now totally remember whether I said this clearly or not, but he shows he goes to a spot where even in Dionysius knows that what happens in the incarnation is not like the way we normally conceive creatures coming or effects proceeding from the cause. I mean, Dionysius himself explicitly says we do not call Jesus man simply insofar as God is cause of man. But that's exactly the whole ground of the apophatic and cataphatic dialectic. God is cause of effects. You reason from effects back to cause, and that creates this yes and no thing. But what Dionysius himself says is that's not what we mean when we say Jesus is human. So, right, like you've got in a lot of different traditions, not even just Christianity, but in the Christian tradition, you got like, say, the debates around anthropomorphism, right? Sometimes we speak of God in such a way that we kind of overly anthropomorphize, projecting what we are on God, and we make God that. What about that time when God made himself an anthropos? God anthropomorphized himself in the incarnation. That's not the same thing as me anthropomorphizing God when I project my distorted figures of human being onto God. So even Dionysius knows that, and he explicitly says that. He says, and the words that Maximus really picks up on is he says he is a essentially complete human. Jesus is, as well as the cause of all humans. But my point, this is why I had to pivot. By the way, I was gonna like go study the relation. My like stated research program was gonna be, what is the relationship between Maximus and Dionysius? Like, how does Maximus receive and maybe change or dialogue with Dionysius' whole theology? That's what I was gonna like write on. That was gonna be my way into whatever. But I kind of had to stop right here. Well, I only got this far because I was like, well, hold on a second. If Maximus is picking up that even Dionysius thinks that Christology has this whole other logic that does not conform simply to the normal logic of vertical logic of cause and effect, or you might say linear of cause and effect, because in the incarnation, the cause is also the effect. in his person, whatever that is, then that means Christology has to go beyond Platonism. Christology has to go beyond any. It doesn't have to be just Platonism. It could even be certain versions of Stoicism. It could be certain versions of Aristotelianism. It's got to go beyond that too, which simply posits God as the unmoved mover, the telos that draws everything in its own natural appetite towards its end. But he's also the alpha. So what am I doing with this now? Because the alpha and the omega is one who's born in the middle of history. So whatever letters in the middle of the alphabet, right? You know, he's also that letter, right, in the whole alphabet. So either we, and here's the big divide, and this goes all the way back to that. I think that same week we read question 60. You know, I was saying this is the big divide, right, in theology. I think more important than most others. Okay, this event I'm talking about, this Christologic, that's what I call it in the book, is this just a sheer exception? Pure fiat. God just did a really weird thing, a marvelous miracle that basically is extrinsic, though, to the way he normally works everywhere else. That is one way to go. You make Christology almost as a matter of course, exceptional and incidental to theology itself. And you can even dress it up in theological terms, right? Like, well, after all, the incarnation was just a response to the fall. So that means if Adam had never fallen, the incarnation might not have even happened. So it's literally extrinsic from the, like, extrinsic in the sense that there's no intelligible, necessary, intimate link or coherence to why incarnation and creation relate at all. They might not have ever related at all, and creation could have still gone its merry way without anything about incarnation, right? So that's one way to go, and I do think that's been the predominant way in the West, and even parts of the East as well. It's not just an East-West thing. Florovsky, for example, just to pull up a more modern Eastern, he's almost totally on that side, and it's almost worse in some ways than like an Aquinas or an Augustine or some Neo-Thomist. I mean, Florovsky says there's like two wills in God. There's the natural will, and then there's his will that's not natural, and creation comes from his will, not from his nature, and so creation might not have ever been. And it's like, what are we doing? I remember reading that essay, Creature and Creation, Creator and Creation, sorry, Creation and Creaturehood is what's called, and I threw it across the room. I was so angry. I was like, this is nonsense. It means that all of it is utterly capricious. God just happened to will one day, and lucky for you and cool, but it could have been literally the opposite. Who cares? I mean, that's a waste of my time. I don't even want to be here with you guys talking about this. I don't want to read any of this stuff if that's what's going on. Because I'm not gaining, I'm not learning anything, really. Nothing fundamental, nothing important. Just everything accidental. So the other way to go is Maximus's way and other people in the tradition's way and Eckhart's way and Eriugenes' way and I think Origen's way as well. He was already getting at that. Gregory of Nyssa, like there's all these other ways you can go, and or this other way you can go, and various variations on that. That is so. Yes, Brian. All that to say, it was really long, but that is really getting to the heart of it, right? But I want to make this last little point because I sometimes have been misunderstood on this by especially people that want to criticize what I'm saying here. I also think, though, it means that Christianity is not simply a negation of Platonism. That's Aristotelianism or something like that, right? Those two oppose each other in certain ways. And of course, the Neoplatonics try to harmonize them. Okay, I get that. I know that. Wouldn't it be just as one-sided to say Plato and Platonism and this whole sense of God as cause is utterly nonsense? Like, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone. I don't know everyone's persuasions here, but I sometimes think that the open theist crowd is just that. They're basically just kind of an inversion of classical theism, which is just Platonism for the masses. And so, but the whole thing is they're both sides are presuming an either or dilemma that you got to choose one over the other. And I simply am not doing that. I'm not doing that. And like, And I think, but it's not just because it's like, I don't like that intellectually, it feels dissatisfying. My fuller argument is it's not Christologically adequate to do either one or the other. You miss something important, crucial to Christ if you choose one or the other. Now, then that does lead to some paradoxical sorts of views, admittedly, but I don't know any other way if I'm going to take Jesus as the beginning and end seriously. And so you're going to get views like maybe ones that I have, like, I think that the content of eternity is just as much a product of what we do that's good in time as it is the cause of what we do or condition of what we do in time. And yet I don't think it's up for grabs. How is that possible? Well, it isn't abstractly. There's no account for how that could be. And so you might just say that's an absurdity or whatever, right? Unless there's this higher sort of logic that's accessible only through Christology, and I think personally through love, where you know what it means for something to be secure and free and a product of creativity, but also the very, very ground of creativity. And there's these ways that we describe that, and they usually sound paradoxical. And they usually sound like the coincidence of opposites, and they usually sound like a perichoresis of Christ's natures and of the world, all this different ways. And a lot of the stuff we read in the mystical too, right? And so I'm saying you can't get the paradox if you're going to prioritize one pole over the other. And when you prioritize one pole over the other, you've already made a judgment about what the paradox is. So you're not innocent there. You've made a real judgment. Or to put it in right terms, just to tie it to this text, you do actually think you know what that existence above existence is like. And so you can circumscribe what's possible for it in that way. And one of the rules you'll make for it is you have to prioritize whatever pole, right? Freedom over, necessity. You've got to prioritize eternity over the process of time, or the reverse, whatever, right? But both of those, whatever side you choose, you have made such a fundamental judgment about the nature of the paradox that you don't even perceive it as a judgment. You just think it's the frame of the debate. So I think this sort of Christology just is a massive challenge to all sides in that way.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.